We will now interrupt your regularly scheduled programming for this Good Old Blades micro podcast.
You've probably heard the term, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And that can't be overstated enough with knife photography. Now, whether you're taking photos yourself or you are getting professional photos done, there are some do's and don'ts and some considerations that you'll want to make when selecting exactly when you address knife photography and how you navigate that space. So when you're presenting your work, especially online, your knives have to be photographed. There's really no two ways about it. Most customers are not going to deal with just a description of your knives, all right? And there are lots of ways to photograph your work by yourself that produce really great results. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those, but then I'll also go into professional photography and some of the pros and cons of that. So first, let's talk about personal photography. When you are taking pictures of your knives, it's always good to make sure that your knives are presentable for photography. Now, there's a lot of things that you can hide inside of a photo. The light will bring to the forefront some flaws in your knives if you have them, some less well-executed finishes, and so on and so forth. And something that's important for you to remember is that there are certain types of finishes that photograph better than others. There are certain types of blade geometries that photograph better than others, and a lot of that has to do with light and light diffusion and light sources. So become familiar with the basic tenets of photography if you want to get into it and photograph your own work. Now, as far as photo equipment goes, cell phones have gotten so ridiculously good that it doesn't make a lot of sense to photograph with a DSLR, or something that's a little expensive from a camera perspective. Especially if you're not like an amateur photographer or take semi-professional photos, it doesn't make sense to spend thousands of dollars on a camera. I think I don't really need to say a whole lot more about that. But something that will help you if you decide that you want to do photography with your phone is a good tripod and also a light box. Now, there's all sorts of different light boxes out there. You want to have something that's appropriate for the size knives that you want to photograph. There's really no light box that's too large, but there are ones that are too small because it's a limiting factor of whether you can fit a large knife in it, especially if you go from pocket knives to cutlery, let's just say. However, something to think about inside of a large light box is providing light itself. Now, there's a lot of light boxes out there that have light sources that are included in it, like LED strips or circles or things like that, but sometimes they're not adequate to light the entire inside surface. So you just want to make sure that you have good light sources on the inside, that you know how to light your work, and typically you'll want to light your work with the brightest K that you can get. So white light versus yellow light, because especially if you're not getting into photographing images in raw mode, where you can make adjustments to your exposure and everything, you'll want to choose a whiter light, because if you're doing especially white backgrounds and overexposing to wash out the background, you'll want to have a good white light, so 5000 K or above. In addition, with the light box, you can choose backgrounds, different paper backgrounds, plastic backgrounds. You can stage things within your light box to give a feel to your photography that is unique to you. Some people use old maps. Some people use old photographs of people, or props like watches or stones or wood or things that they work with from a natural material perspective, and you can mix that up. Just make sure that you have a light box that's big enough for you to play with it, and you can also pick and choose your backgrounds. One thing that's really good to do when you're photographing your work, especially in the digital age, is to take enough photos where you can play around with them and see which ones you like the best. A tripod helps to get the most crisp pictures, because even in good lighting situations, you can still have wobble in your camera, that when you take the picture, even though it tries to stabilize it, it washes the image out. So just be careful of that. Use a tripod when you can, and use good lighting. Again, I'll go back to lighting quite a bit. But with certain types of satin finishes, I've noticed personally that I have some issues. Even though they're a really good satin finish to the eye, sometimes the light doesn't play very well on the blade. I'm not sure if that's because they're 14-inch hollows, so on and so forth. I might just be making excuses. But it's not like when I have a perfectly executed satin finish that I can just throw it in a light box and it'll always look the best. And even though some makers will use a light box to give an indication of whether their finish is good, and they can look at the knife and all of its parts with really good lighting in order to inspect it for quality, that doesn't necessarily mean that the knife was made poorly or that the finish is poor when it doesn't photograph well, especially when you know that the finish looks really good to the naked eye. And if you take it out into the sunlight or with natural light, you don't see any flaws. Sometimes artificial light and the way that it's sourced makes a difference, and it can be difficult to photograph. So when you're messing with your lighting sources, remember that diffused light, or light that is scattered. So if you have an opaque filter or a piece of paper or something like that to soften the light, it'll actually help quite a bit in providing a softer glow or light source to your work, where you don't have to worry about like the individual light bulbs or light elements on a LED or things like that affecting how the light is refracting off of your blade. So I highly recommend getting into photographing your knives by yourself, because that plays into being able to publish to social media and things like that, and draw in people to your work. It's also important to know that you don't necessarily need a light box if you're doing like natural, bespoke type of surroundings, like outside, holding it in natural light or propping it against something. But like logs or fences or rocks or grass or whatever it might be that's outside, where you get natural light. The problem with that is that even though they look really great, the timing at which you photograph your knives might be inconsistent, and therefore the lighting and everything is inconsistent. So if you have a really great source for taking outside photos, I think that they look really great. That's one of my favorite ways to take photos. However, I will say that it's also one of the most unpredictable, so sometimes can be frustrating. Now let's go into professional photography. The largest benefit to professional photography over your own is that unless you want to spend a long time buying the right equipment and getting tied in with publishers and things like that, a professional photographer does it for a living. Just like you might source out sheath building or things like that, or engraving in your shop. Sourcing out photography is good in a lot of cases, because the equipment to get just really clean, high-resolution pictures is difficult. But then also to think about all the different backgrounds and props and things that a photographer does artistically to stage the photograph. For you to learn that, man, it takes forever. Now, you can do it, obviously. I mean, people get into engraving and spend tens of thousands of dollars on engraving equipment because they want to do everything themselves. But I will say that, like Sharp by Coop, he does a really, really great job of photographing knives with a low overhead to getting your work in there. The one thing I would recommend with professional photographers is that if there was ever a time to make sure that everything is absolutely photogenic and perfect on your knives, it would be during photography. Like no scratches that are not supposed to be there, good clean buffs on your handle material that you're expecting to be there as part of the knife build. Don't wash out your maker's mark or leave low grit scratches or things like that in there. Like, it should be pristine. The reason why is because when you take it to a professional photographer, they can play with the light to hide things. A photographer that has a lot of integrity towards just representing the work as it stands will not really try to fudge or mess with it too much. And no photographer in knives should be photoshopping flaws out of your work just to make them look better than reality. And part of the reason I would discourage you from working with photographers that Photoshop everything is if you're getting your knives photographed and then a customer gets it in their hands and it looks like hot garbage, then I feel it's disingenuous and false advertising. Now, that's my opinion, and take it for what it is. And I know lots of photographers do Photoshop their work or take minor flaws or things like that out. But rather than giving a photographer the decision on whether to make those modifications in post for you or not, why don't you just send them out a really stellar blade and allow their natural art and capturing your work to stand on its own? And I think it's really important. Like, don't make a photographer make the decision to fudge the quality of your work by sending in shoddy work. It's a waste of your money. It's not a waste of their time because they're getting paid for it. But I think that your work will be better represented if you do everything that you can from a diligence perspective to get it like primmed and prepped before you send it in. Another good thing about using photographers is their ability to network with different magazines and publishing to get your work seen by others. My work has been published several times in Blade magazine, and one benefit of that has been obviously my exposure that I've gotten, but also I didn't have to do any of the work to get it in there. I got my knives photographed by Coop, and he went through all the rigmarole to submit to publishers, and it got picked up in Blade magazine. And I think that was probably the easiest time I've spent marketing myself through photography. However, it's a little pricey. A standard single side photograph might cost you around $175 to $200. And that can be a lot when you're trying to build your portfolio up, because the cost of a photograph might be the cost of a knife, and it gets kind of difficult from an economics perspective to do that all the time. But if you think wisely about it and you choose works that really represent your progression in knives and the envelope that you're pushing, I think that you'll benefit by getting them photographed by a professional. I hope that helped. I hope you guys can think a little bit more about knife photography, both at home and getting a professional to do it. I don't think that you'll be disappointed if you send it off. They always look stellar. I've never been disappointed by any knives that I've had photographed. So good luck, and let me know if you have any questions.